The lower nature, when it has forgotten itself, it's Anisha. It's not the Isha, it's not the Lord. But still there is somewhere its sanction. And it is that sanction which gives the nature such a strong hold. In fact, when he speaks of struggle with the lower nature, Aurobindo gives a very beautiful, there are so many methods he has given. But one of them is very interesting. He says all that the soul has to do is to withdraw its sanction. Sounds very simple, but it really works. Now this withdrawal comes from inside. When the sanction is withdrawn, he says the nature will continue by habit for some time, but because the inner sanction is not there, the inner being or the inmost being at some point has refused, it doesn't participate in it, it no more takes rasa in it, it separates itself from it. It even feels sad and sorry about it. Then after a while, this outer nature runs and begins to dwindle till finally it stops going that way. Such a beautiful way from inside to change human nature. This struggle of the soul with nature has been the subject of many, all yogas, because without this, the very fundamental first step of yoga cannot be taken. And that's why in yoga, in Aurobindo's yoga, there is, in all yogas, but in Aurobindo's yoga it is put like that there is a positive side which is the side of a seeking. It takes the form of aspiration, it takes the form of turning towards the light and the right, it takes the form of concentration, quietude, etc., etc. But also there is a negative side of the yoga which is supposed to occupy not all the time but a considerable amount of effort. Aurobindo almost says 70% should be the positive side, that is the seeking, the aspiration, but 30% should be engaged with the rejection part of the lower nature. The lower nature which does not let the psychic emerge. And unless this happens, the process does not come to full fruition. There are so many letters of Aurobindo. Someone has asked that I have seen X. For 40 years he has been there. And one day X sees a dream. And in the dream he sees something in himself which is very shocking. So why has asked Aurobindo that how come someone who has stayed for 40 years is still shocked by seeing something in the dream, and how can this happen? And then Aurobindo describes that because X has practiced basically mental control, whereas the real thing in this yoga is the psychic emergence. And unless the psychic emerges, nothing genuine has been done. In fact, the letters of Aurobindo, whatever be the illuminations, experiences of Ananda, etc., yet unless the secret soul has emerged, the very first radical step has not yet been taken. So we have spoken of some of the, from Aurobindo and the mother's letters, some of the positive ways towards this soul emergence, and more we'll be speaking. But today maybe we could focus a little bit upon the negative side of the yoga, which is as necessary, in fact, in our present stage of evolution perhaps even more necessary. And its importance, Aurobindo says in one of his letters, these are all from letters on yoga, volume 3 largely, whatever I'll be reading today. Nothing that may have been done before, no inner illumination, experience, power or ananda is of any eventual value if this is not done. He's speaking of this as the lower nature, which is basically, this lower nature is nothing else but a shadow of the higher nature. And in traditional yogas, the method is, even in the Gita, there is a very interesting method that instead of identifying with the lower nature, one goes by the soul nature, Swabhava and Swadharma, which is more true. But in Aurobindo's yoga, even that is not enough, because one has to embody a higher divine nature. And for that, not only it is enough to remove the thorns of the lower nature, but it has to become strong, ready and fit to embody a higher nature. So this becomes the decisive ordeal of the yoga, where one struggles with the lower nature. If the little external personality is to persist in retaining its obscure and limited, its petty and ignoble, its selfish and false and stupid human consciousness, not a very charitable word for our human consciousness, but like a very loving dad, Sri Aurobindo can do this, and he should do this so that we know ourselves. This amounts to a flat negation of the work and the sadhana. I have no intention of giving my sanction to a new edition of the old fiasco. The old fiasco was that I liberate my inner soul, it doesn't matter what is happening to my outer nature. And that's what Sri Aurobindo brings out in one of his poems, which is actually probably based on one of the experiences which Sri Ramakrishna had with a Vedantin who was moving with a harem, and when Ramakrishna asked him, "What is this?" He says, "How does it matter? I have realized the self." So Sri Ramakrishna is supposed to have remarked, "I spit on your Vedanta, that you speak of this kind of a self-realization." And Sri Aurobindo says, if truly self-realization is the only goal, then actually it doesn't matter. But in this yoga it matters again because it is not the only thing and it doesn't stop here. So the old fiasco is nature has to be modified only to the extent that it can liberate itself. The rest can continue, it doesn't matter. So Sri Aurobindo says, I have no intention of giving my sanction to the old fiasco. A partial and transient spiritual opening within, with no true and radical change in the law of the external nature. Outer nature is all that we are most of the time, our thoughts, feelings, habits, reactions, actions. If then any sadhak refuses in practice to admit this change, or if he refuses even to admit the necessity for any change of his lower vital being and his habitual external personality, I am entitled to conclude that whatever his profession, he has not accepted either myself or my yoga. So it is not enough to say that, I am a disciple of Sri Aurobindo. The beauty here is actually, Sri Aurobindo, the way he writes, one can feel so much compassion even when he is, hard. He is still so gentle. First he is saying, if a sadhak refuses in practice to admit this change, but then look at the compassion part. Then he says, or if he refuses even to admit the necessity for the change. So at least we must start by admitting that yes, this must change. And then Sri Aurobindo says, then I am entitled to accept that I have the right to say that you may say that you have accepted me, but actually you have not accepted. And then he brings in the still deeper compassion. I am well aware that this change is not easy. Sri Aurobindo knows that he is asking us to do something which is truly superhuman. I am well aware that this change is not easy. The dynamic will towards it does not come at once. Even the will towards the change does not come. It's much easier to have a will towards the divine, some kind of an aspiration to awaken. But the will to change external nature, the dynamic will, not just a passive will, doesn't come easily. Even afterwards, the sadhak often feels helpless against the force of habit. So he says, I know all this. Knowing this, the mother and myself have shown and are still showing sufficient patience in giving time for the true spirit to come up and form and act effectively in the external being of those around us. But if in anyone this part not only becomes obstinate, so Sri Aurobindo is giving us maximum possible rope. He is saying at least admit the possibility of a change. He is taking the other extreme where this part becomes obstinate, self-assertive or aggressive. That whatever you may say, I am right and I will continue my human nature the way it is. He says not only it becomes obstinate, self-assertive or aggressive, but is supported and justified by the mind and will and tries to spread itself in the atmosphere, then it is a different and very serious matter. It's interesting, these letters, and especially the next one where Sri Aurobindo speaks of some fundamental problems that one encounters in human nature. This letter incidentally has been written to someone who is quite respected, and obviously it shows that even the strong ones had to go through these difficulties. among one of the early sadhaks present during the over-mental descent. This letter has been written. And when we read it, we realize when Aurobindo said even the strong had to go there with their difficulties. So one has to grapple with them. And here is another letter, this long letter. The difficulty in the lower vital being is that it is still wedded to its old self and in revolt against the light. It is not only not surrendered either to a greater truth or to myself and the mother. Look at it so beautifully. Aurobindo is saying either to greater truth or to myself and the mother, they are one and the same, essentially. But it has up to now no such will and hardly any idea even of what true surrender is. When the lower vital assumes this attitude, it takes its stand upon a constant affirmation of the old personality and the past forms of the lower nature. Now these Aurobindo discusses, speaks in great detail, and then he says, often it tries to persuade itself and to convince others that these things are the only right reason and right way of acting. Not only do we continue with our old nature under various disguises. One disguise is, what does the divine understand about world? He is not after all practical. We are practical human beings. So we must act according to our human nature. But this is precisely where Aurobindo is telling us that we must put the finger and change. When this lower vital being is allowed to influence the action, as happens when the sadhak in any way endorses its suggestions, its attitude, whether masked to himself or coming to the surface. The word used in the mother is subterfuges. He says on one side, one is pulled, but on the other side, these subterfuges are keeping the person down. It's like small weeds which hold the feet, and one tries to come up to the surface of the water, but one is unable to swim because the feet are caught up in those weeds. So this is the situation of human beings, us human beings, that Aurobindo describes in the poem Tree, that our hands are like the topmost boughs towards heaven, but roots are held badly by the earth nature. And he says, after drawing this comparison between the tree and human soul, he says, this is the soul of man, his body and brain hungry for earth, his heavenly flight detained. So here Aurobindo is telling us in no uncertain terms, if he is frank with himself and straightforward to the mother, he will begin to recognize the source and nature of the obstacle and will soon be on the direct road to correct and change it. They are part of earth nature and all of us have it. Aurobindo is not telling us that some are free and some are born free. Everyone has it. The only problem is that we keep on justifying it. But this, when under the adverse influence he persistently refuses to be, he prefers to hide up these movements under any kind of concealment, denial, justification or excuse, or rather shelter. In the nature, the resistance takes certain characteristics forms which add to the confusion and to the difficulty of transformation. So now he is telling us that it takes certain particular forms which we can identify with. Normally when one speaks of difficulties of nature, one speaks of very broad terms. And of course, in the popular editions of yoga, one doesn't speak of it because it will reduce the TRP and the salability of the yoga. So most modern techniques don't even speak about it. They just say, do this technique, take this mantra, do this concentration and you will realize. But all genuine yogis, whether we take the case of Buddha, in the Dhammapada, so much he speaks of the Eightfold Path, where there are a lot of things about working upon oneself, upon one's nature. Even in the Yoga of Nirvana, he speaks of what is the necessity of mind control, control of speech, control of action, etc., etc. Patanjali spoke of Yama and Niyama. Sri Krishna speaks of the entire pranashyati. If one takes the path of anger, fear, lust, one goes down and eventually destroys it. One loses intelligence, one loses memory. He speaks of the whole path of self-destruction. He even speaks about the Deva Asura and Deva Asuri Sampada, the Devic nature and the Asuric nature, one which helps in the evolution, the other which comes in the way of the evolution. Sri Ramakrishna, another genuine yogi of our times, spoke of two serious obstacles, lust and greed. But of course, popular versions of the yoga seem to do away with it, and that itself is a sign that there is a genuine and a serious falsehood hiding there. Because if someone says that one can do yoga like a cakewalk, it's obviously just to increase the celebrity. Like good advertisers, one doesn't speak of the other side of the coin. And it's only when one actually goes through the process one realizes the difficulty. So Sri Aurobindo first tells us about the difficulties of our nature and what we have to do upon it. Of course, maybe next time we'll read about how to work upon them. But first, just to identify them, Sri Aurobindo says it takes certain characteristic forms. One is, number one, Sri Aurobindo has put them as 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 characteristic forms. 1, vanity and arrogance. Of course, we are all great sadhaks. So this is the start of the vanity. We are an elite club, marked out for something very special. Not ordinary mortals. We have already worked upon our nature, others have to work. So all this is about vanity and arrogance. Sri Aurobindo says, a certain vanity and arrogance and self-assertive rajasic vehemence, which in this smaller vital being are, for those who have a pronounced strength in these parts, the deformation of the vital force and habit of leading and domination that certain qualities in the higher vital give them. Sri Aurobindo is describing like a deep psychologist that they are the deformation of a higher truth. The higher truth is the truth of strength, of leading, divine leading, and yet in the lower nature it is completely deformed and one becomes puffed up with a rajasic vehemence and ego. This is accompanied by an excessive amor propre, which creates the necessity of making a figure. After all, it's not enough to be a sadhak, one must look like a sadhak. So one starts with a dress code, starts with assuming a certain posture, even a certain gesture before others, because that's the easier part. The difficult part is doing it inside. But the easier part is to dress up in a certain way that impresses others and others feel, yes, looks like a genuine yogi. So Sri Aurobindo is telling us the necessity, this is starts with this defect. This is accompanied by an excessive amor propre, which create the necessity of making a figure. And that's why in this ashram, this is so beautiful that we don't have a dress code like the sannyasis, because otherwise, the moment one wears a gerua vastra, one believes that one has already realized. But for one person in whom the sannyasin's robe is justified, there are thousands in whom it has become the symbol of deceit and hypocrisy. So, necessity of making a figure, maintaining by any means position and prestige. This is another problem. If one is given a position, one doesn't want to let go because it's so difficult. What will people think after all? That I have failed, I have not succeeded. But here, the only thing that counts is sincerity. One may have any position. There is a very interesting small letter which interestingly is there in collected works of the mother as well as in SABCL. So probably it was signed by Sri Aurobindo and the mother both. Some letters are like that, or maybe written at different times, I really don't know. The letter is well known or unknown, has absolutely no importance from the point of view of yoga. One man who earnestly pursues the yoga is much more important than 1,000 well-known persons. How beautiful. And we still want to become well known and maintain position and prestige, even of posturing before others. We must not only be nice, as they say, we must look nice. After some time it becomes, we must look nice. It doesn't matter what we are inside. And in this yoga, the masks are ripped off. And that is why many things which we find in Sri Aurobindo circles, if I may use the word, because now it's not confined to ashram, may appear uncomfortable, but actually it is simply because the light of this truth does not allow masks. In many yogas it is just there and one accepts it. But here it is not allowed. So whether it be here or elsewhere, the action of truth removes the masks. In one of her letters, mother says, do not do anything here which you cannot do publicly, because nothing can remain hidden here for long. I don't know whether she said for long or not, but it's implied. So, one should not do that. Even of posturing before others. And then she says something very interesting. Influencing, controlling or helping them. Helping is under quote. That after all I am helping someone. Claiming the part of a superior sadhak. One with greater knowledge and with occult powers. So in this yoga one has to be very, very careful. There are no senior Swamijis. This can be a very dangerous thing. I know in Bangalore there was once a very interesting event where a junior Swami was called to inaugurate a mill, because not from we don't have system of Swamijis, but let me not name because it doesn't matter, but a well-known mission. So when the junior Swami went and inaugurated in all his earnestness, the senior Swamiji got very cross with him, and the reason was, how could you go when I am there? So when senior Swamijis are there, the junior Swami is not supposed to go and inaugurate, because senior Swami after all has suffered and struggled the rigors of yoga for 20 years more. So, but in here it doesn't matter. And this was the true Upanishadic yoga. There is a very interesting verse in the Upanishad. I don't remember the exact lines, but they are very beautiful when I had heard them. That I have seen, the mystic is saying, I have seen a strange spectre before my eyes. What is the strange spectre? He says, I see the Guru is young and the disciple is old. Guru Yuva, Sishya Vriddha. And then he says another thing very interesting, and the Guru is not speaking a word at all. And Sishya Shidyanti Sarva Sanshaya. All his sanshaya doubts are vanishing. He is not speaking a word. I have seen such a marvel before my eyes. So here there is no such outer thing or outer claim. In fact, even inwardly, even to imagine that one is superior to somebody is to open the path towards self-destruction, because in this yoga one just keeps moving, and in the ancient yogas it was called as hill after hill. When the true meaning of the word Aryan, Sri Aurobindo says, is he who is a warrior. So how is he warrior? When he conquers one hill, he is not satisfied looking back to his kingdom. He is out to conquer the other hill. Like Alexander marching through the plains. He is not interested that what I have conquered. He says, this is not enough. There is so much more to be done. And that is the spirit of youth in this yoga. So Sri Aurobindo is telling us that this is the first effect. Then, of course, he says that on a smaller scale, these defects of vanity, arrogance and rajasic violence are present in most human natures. He's not saying that this is unique to someone. That's why he's saying it's a characteristic forms. The second is disobedience and indiscipline. Now, it is again very interesting, because here disobedience and indiscipline are given its true sense. Disobedience and indiscipline, this lower part of the being is always random, wayward, self-assertive and unwilling to accept the imposition on it of any order, discipline other than its own idea or impulse. So that's why a lot of training in yoga is just to get trained into this idea. So someone asked mother once, Mother, why don't you tell me exactly what I should do? So why don't you just give me an order? In fact, the question was, why don't you give me an order that I should do this and I will do it? Mother says, my child, I do give orders only to those whom I am so sure that they will never disobey it. Because if I give the orders, then it is a divine command. And if you don't follow it, it has very serious spiritual consequences. So, out of compassion, I don't give orders. I just let you move your own way. I just give suggestions. If you ask me, I tell you, okay, these are the possibilities, you take it. But I give orders only to those whom I know will listen and not disobey, because it becomes a very serious thing. So here Sri Aurobindo is telling us, Its defects, even from the beginning, stand in the way of the efforts of the higher vital to impose on the nature a truly regenerating tapasya. It's not even about divine, just the higher vital, which is more refined, tries to impose itself on the lower. This habit of disobedience and disregard of discipline is so strong that it does not always need to be deliberate. The response to it seems to be immediate, irresistible, and instinctive. This disobedience to the mother is repeatedly promised, this obedience to the mother is repeatedly promised or professed, but the action done or the course followed is frequently the very opposite of the profession or promise. This constant indiscipline is a radical obstacle to the sadhana and the worst possible example to others. So, of course, the obedience is to Sri Aurobindo and the mother. But actually, if we look at it in the larger context, even in normal life, it is a good training and practice. There is a very good little story about one of the freedom fighters, Sukhdev. We have heard his name, Sukhdev, Bhagat Singh and Rajguru. They were the three who were hanged because of their freedom struggle. So there is a story narrated that when Sukhdev was going in a train, and suddenly, as was the custom or the practice those days, some people, British soldiers, police caught him and started beating. Normally Sukhdev would react, and he was one of those who were like born free. But that day Sukhdev just kept taking the beating. He didn't utter a word. So when he was beaten black and blue and left aside, someone asked him, why someone like you just kept sitting? You didn't even feel like reacting? He said, no, I thought today let me practice. How much can I really endure? So he took it just as a practice in his endurance. So sometimes even when there are absurd orders, they are really absurd logically, but it's a good practice just to practice discipline and obedience. So this is one of the ways that one can look at it. It teaches us to subordinate the ego. So Sri Aurobindo is saying, of course, the real practice of discipline is in terms of mother and Sri Aurobindo, or in terms of our own higher nature. The lower should listen to the higher vital. The third is dissimulation and falsity of speech. This is a very subtle and delicate but a very interesting point. Dissimulation and falsity of speech. This is an exceedingly injurious habit of the lower nature. Those who are not straightforward cannot profit by the mother's help. Such a powerful one-liner of Sri Aurobindo. Those who are not straightforward. And one place Sri Aurobindo says, my child, if my child is of course not there, but he says, if you allow an untruth to slip through your pen, how can you claim to be a servant of truth if you allow untruth to slip through your pen? So one has to be so thorough. Of course, he's not speaking of a memory lapse or something, but he's speaking of where we deliberately just allow a little bit untruth, that after all, how does it matter? It may be a, Ashwathama Hatohata, even that, Sri Aurobindo was asked that did Krishna speak a lie? Well, Mahabharata speaks of half-truth, but Sri Aurobindo says, I am not aware of any instance where Sri Krishna ever spoke a lie. It's very interesting. It's directly from Sri Aurobindo's mouth. So many things we justify that after all it's okay. So Sri Aurobindo is saying it's not okay. Those who are not straightforward cannot profit by the mother's help, for they themselves turn it away. Unless they change, they cannot hope for the descent of the supramental light and truth into the lower vital and physical nature. They remain stuck in their own self-created mud and cannot progress. Then he says the types it takes. Often it is not mere exaggeration or a false use of the imagination embroidering on the actual truth that is marked in the sadhak. One kind of dissimulation is exaggeration, which is very common. When one reports an incident, one tells one side of the story. This is a very common thing. And unless one takes care to listen to the other side, one can be totally misled and be carried away into that's why they say that any true person who has to judge anything should listen to two sides of the story. But even that becomes falsified because each one exaggerates. And it can go to what extent? Once it is said that it's there in Champaklal Treasures or Champaklal Speaks, where someone as faithful as Champaklalji, he is narrating an experience and the mother suddenly says, Champaklal, don't boast. And he says, Mother, I am not boasting. So look at that. I mean, even someone as faithful, as diligent as him, one could just exaggerate things, and sometimes it's simply because of imagination. And that is why even to speak of one's experiences, not only it can puff up the vanity, and many times it also invites jealousy from others and envy from others. Often one exaggerates, one adds this or that, a little bit of, spice and mirchi and masala. So seldom one ever has a true account of things, and it's a great thing to have that. So Aurobindo is telling us, it's not just about exaggeration because of imagination, but also a positive denial and distortion, as well as a falsifying concealment of facts. One hides things deliberately, distorts things just a little bit here and there, and changes the full meaning of whatever happened. This he does sometimes to cover up his disobedience or wrong or doubtful course of action. Mother knew it. If one reads the agenda, one is wonderstruck. And she says, almost she laments, all the time they come and tell me lies, false things. Imagine, and she knew it, she saw it. And one could still continue speaking before the divine, knowing fully well that she would know it. So she says, this he does sometimes to cover up his disobedience or wrong or doubtful course of action, sometimes to keep up his position at others, to get his own way or indulge his preferred habits and desires. So if one speaks the truth, it will bring one down in the eyes of others, not realizing that what matters in yoga is only what we are in the eyes of the divine. But then it's difficult. So sincerity is the prize. Very often, when one has this kind of vital habit, he clouds his own consciousness and does not altogether realize the falsity of what he is saying or doing. So this is compared to, like, if one is in a zone of light, it's not that suddenly one walks into darkness. One starts with this habit of little bit concealing, little bit justifying, little bit error. How does it matter? But this little bit begins to grow, and then Aurobindo is saying the consciousness becomes more and more clouded. And there comes a time when one is in dark but doesn't even realize that one is in dark. So he's telling us that if it's not checked right from the beginning, slowly it becomes like a second nature, and one doesn't even realize what one is doing. But in much that he says and does, it is quite impossible to extend to him even this inadequate excuse. So he's saying the excuse often which is given is, well, I don't realize that I am doing this. So Aurobindo is saying, well, it's kind of excuse but an inadequate excuse. And very often this excuse is really inadequate because one by one's own choice willfully walks step by step till the time comes when one is so identified with the difficult side of one's nature that one doesn't even realize what has happened. And finally, the fourth thing, which is the commonest. If we see in series of order, the least common to the most common, the commonest is dangerous habit of constant self-justification, almost universal. A dangerous habit of constant self-justification. When this becomes strong in the sadhak, it is impossible to turn him in this part of his being to the right consciousness and action, because at each step his whole preoccupation is to justify himself. So whenever there is a pressure put, one says, but I am like this. but I did because of this. I got angry because X did this to me. Otherwise, I will not be angry, and it can go to absurd extent. And Aurobindo has this, with this characteristic sense of humor, this aphorism which many of us would be knowing. He says, medieval ascetics hated women. Why? Because they blamed them for the cause of their downfall. And then Aurobindo says, one should think more nobly both of God and of women. And then he says that if a woman has caused the downfall, is it her fault or yours? So beautiful. And yet in today's times also there is a sect where I had a bad luck to share a platform where this great yogi came who was supposed to be Brahmaleen and 108 times Sri Sri Sri, all kinds of things. And in that sect, you are not supposed to see a woman if you are a yogi. What was amazing to me was there were many women followers. If for nothing else, for the sake of self-dignity, one should have, reacted. But all the women, when this yogi came, so-called yogi, every woman sat behind and that part was put under dark. So, with my difficult nature, I could not, keep quiet. So when I was supposed to speak, so they were all introduced him as Brahm Yogi and all these things. So I couldn't help saying that we have seen half Brahman, where half of our population is excluded, but we should also realize the other half of the Brahman, basically referring to the Shakti aspect. But it was a gentle irony also, because we keep justifying. And then he's saying his mind rushes at once to maintain his own idea, his own position, or his own course of action. This he is ready to do by any kind of argument, sometimes the most clumsy and foolish or inconsistent with what he has been protesting the moment before. And if one really looks at it, one would wonder that we do it all the time. We tell children, don't shout, and say it with so much of loud voice that the child doesn't know what is the message. Shout or not shout. By example, shout. By word, don't shout. So he's saying that few moments before what we are protesting, we are doing it. Sometimes we are doing it at the same time. This is a constant misuse, but nonetheless a misuse of the thinking mind. But it takes in him exaggerated proportions, and so long as he keeps to it, it will be impossible for him to see or live the truth. So we'll not go into the sides, very dark and dangerous side, but these are some of the things Aurobindo has pointed out. Next time we'll speak of the methods by which we can actually get rid of these thorns of human nature. Plenty of things Aurobindo has spoken.